welcome to another exciting episode of Consciousness this month. So, the general idea that I've had was to kind of explore a topic, maybe have a short video on it, and then introduce some guests talking about that topic. So, last month in June, we were talking about conferences because it's conference season in the summer. So, I talked about consciousness conferences, in particular, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, which had its meeting in Krakow, Poland, and the Towards the Science of Consciousness, or more recently known as simply the Science of Consciousness Conference, and that's had its meeting in April. So it seemed to be relevant, and then I had a discussion with Hakwan Lau about the conferences and things going on there. So this month, the topic that I'm turning to is mental content and knowledge of one's own mind. So roughly speaking, that's the kind of plan that I have. We talk about what it means for the mind to have some content, and to talk about how it is that we acquire knowledge of what might be going on in our own mind. So to take that second one first, introspection is often thought to give us some kind of special access to our own mental states, such that I have a kind of proprietary relationship to what's going on inside my own mind. If I feel a pain, then I know I feel a pain. If I believe I feel a pain, then I can't be wrong about that. These are some general ideas. It all kind of starts back in the modern tradition, in the West at least, with Descartes. And Descartes made some claims about the infallibility and incorrigibility of introspection. So infallibility, the general idea there, you can't be wrong about what's going on in your own mind. Now, incorrigibility is a related property, but different. So to be incorrigible is to be such that you can't be corrected. So the first idea is suggest that I have kind of direct access to my own mind, that I know it directly, without mediation, with nothing standing between me and it. And so, of course, I couldn't be wrong on this view, because there's no gap between the mental thing which I know about and me, the knower. It's this immediacy. The second claim, though, incorrigibility, is such that, well, it's not so much that there's this directness, but it's that you're the only one who has access to it. So to be incorrigible, if you say you're in pain, then there's no one who could come to you and say, wait a minute, you're wrong. I've looked at your brain scan. The brain is acting in this way. And that indicates that you're in agonizing pain right now. Of course, if you said, I don't feel any pain, I don't know what you're talking about, if that was your response, then we would have to ask the question, is the person who studies neuroscience and is looking at your brain and the states that it may be in, do they know better than you do about the contents of your current experience? And many people find that to be that the answer has to be no, in that they just don't make, it doesn't make sense for a third person, someone to come from the outside and say, look, you're wrong about what you're saying. I know better than you. So it seems like incorrigibility is another common sense kind of claim about how we know about our own minds. So these are different, obviously. I mean, they're related clearly, but they're different. So they're different in the following sense. Suppose that you have incorrigibility, but not infallibility. So in that case, you could be wrong about what mental state you're in. Maybe you're tasting chocolate and mistake that for pain. That's a pretty drastic case. But if you could be wrong about that, if you could be wrong about that, then you might still be incorrigible in the sense that there would be no one who is in a better position than you to make that assessment. So even if you got it wrong, you could, no one could tell. And of course, the other way they come apart as well. So if you have infallible access to your own mental states, it may be that you're not incorrigible. So maybe you do have direct knowledge of your mental states, but also maybe there are third-person measures which may get at that in the same sort of interesting way. So these two properties are related to each other. They're often conflated, I would say, but they're different. And the traditional view has it that we have both of these properties in our access to our own minds. So that's a kind of starting place with respect to how it is that we know about the mind. And this cause not just with respect to mental states like pain or itches or tickles, but it's often also thought to be with what just you're thinking about. So many people say, look, you have the same kind of, if you want to know what you're thinking about, if someone asks you, what are you thinking about? Well, who's in a better position to know that than you? So if you say you're thinking about the Eiffel Tower or the Empire State Building or Santa Claus or something like that, then it seems like, well, you would know, right? You would know what things it is that are for your mind and that you have access to them in this kind of way. So I think one of the more interesting developments in philosophy and also in the empirical sciences has been putting pressure on these kinds of claims about the access that we have to our own minds. Now, there are still people out there who think that these, so at least some of these ideas for some mental states have got to be correct. So I want to have people discussing both sides of this issue this month. All sides of the issue. There are more than both sides, I guess I would say. But it certainly seems to be the case that that there are some room for slippage here. And a lot of this will depend, I think, on how you spell out the relevant abilities. What do you think introspection is? And in particular, whether what your particular view about mental content is. So let me just say a little something about that. So this is involving the notion of intentionality. And that's a technical term that philosophers like to throw around. So it doesn't mean intentional in the normal sense that normal people who aren't philosophers would use that word like I did it on purpose. It doesn't mean that. So intentionality, depending on who you talk to, goes back to the Middle Ages with some philosophers, but probably was brought into psychology and philosophy by Brentano. Franz Brentano, from his work, Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, I think it was called, but I'm not a Brentano scholar, so don't quote me on that. But the point is that this is one way that it got introduced into the mainstream currently, and his idea was that he was looking for something which would distinguish mental things from non-mental things, and that's a worthy quest. You might wonder what it is that makes something mental as opposed to not mental. This is something which we all have to face, and Brentano's idea, if I understand it correctly, was that something is mental when it's characterized by what he called intentional inexistence. Intentional inexistence is roughly the idea that the objects that your thoughts are directed at need not to actually exist. So the classic example is unicorns, or the fountain of youth, I think, is even a more classic example. If someone is looking for the fountain of youth, they're looking for something. Someone's walking around Florida and they say, I'm looking for the fountain of youth. They're not looking for a concept or an idea, so one might think. They're looking for an actual fountain with these magical properties. So the thing which they're thinking about, the thing which their intentions are aimed at, the thing which they're searching the world for is not there. And Brentano thought this was something only mental states could exhibit, that there were, according to him, no cases where you have this kind of relation to a non-existent thing, whatever that may be. Of course, that's very puzzling, because putting it that way makes you wonder, what is a relation to a non-existent thing, and how could there ever be such a naturalistic thing, explainable in terms of the natural world and the natural kinds of properties that exist. And this, I think, is more closely associated with Chisholm, maybe, sometimes called the puzzle of intentionality. So there, the idea is that we have this tension between these things we want to say. On the one hand, it seems like thinking about something is a relation between you and it. However you want to spell that out. Is it a representation relation or something? Some kind of directedness of the mind towards the thing seems like a natural way to say a natural way to characterize what is going on when we, for instance, say, thinking about the Empire State Building. It seems like my thought is directed at that thing. So it seems relational in that sense. Of course, if there's a relation, it seems like there should be the things there to be related. So if you're thinking about non-existent things, then it's not clear which thing in the world you're related to, especially given that the physical world doesn't include the thing. So if I'm thinking about Dracula, vampires, unicorns, whatever, then it doesn't seem like there's any such object in the world for me to be related to. And that puts pressure on the idea that this is a relation. So either you abandon the idea that you can give a naturalistic account and say, well, there are these these things which are real but don't exist physically, and some people have tried to make claim of that. I guess make sense of that. I guess probably the most famous is Meinong, who gets kind of slandered with this view a lot. Excuse me, who gets slandered with this view a lot. And according to a lot of interpretations, Meinong thought that there was this thing called subsistence or something, which is sort of a not like, well, existence is being physically real or something, and subsistence is being something else, but it's still kind of being real, and you can have thoughts related to that. So that's, people have tried to make sense of that, and maybe Platonism in general, so these non-physical abstract ideas or something like that, is friendly with that. But many people who want to try to endorse some kind of naturalistic theory, just having brains and maybe not some non-physical properties if you're into those, but they would still be natural, part of the natural world and governed by laws that we, for the most part, are familiar with from the physical world, maybe supplemented with some fundamental laws that relate these things, blah, blah, blah. So it depends on your views here. But there seems to be a real puzzle here about how you can give an account of what it is for the mind to be directed towards something, how it is that we can make sense of the claim that we say all the time, that I'm thinking about what I'm going to eat for lunch, or I'm thinking about what I had for lunch yesterday, or I'm thinking about the Eiffel Tower. So on the one hand, it seems relational. On the other hand, it seems like it can't really be relational because of the puzzle of non-existence. And so people have struggled with this, and there are various kinds of views. My own background, having studied with people like Michael Devitt and Saul Kripke and Ruth Millikan, my own background has a kind of heavily influenced flavor of causal theories and teleosemantic theories. And so according to these kinds of theories, there is a relation between you and the things that you're thinking about. It's either some kind of causal relationship, such that the token that you have in your mind, whatever physical state it is, has some relationship back to the actual item in question in terms of causes and effects. So to take the obvious case of a name, there's a person born, you give that person a name, and then you might think, this is kind of Saul Kripke's picture, naming a necessity, you might think that the name is passed down through a chain. So you say, this is George, and then you tell someone else, and you kind of give them the ability to refer to George. I say, this is George, and then that gets passed down, and then 400 years later I can say, what about George? And now it traces back to the historical guy. Now, that doesn't really answer one particular question, which is, suppose that you have a thought about a cat or something, and you say, well, the mental state that I'm in is sort of causally related to cats, and you have to spell that out in more detail. But then people might say, well, okay, so how does it pick out a cat as opposed to a cat as an animal or a cat as a furry thing? And here I think you really need to put something about function and purpose in. So the common sense idea would be that it is the function of the mental state to represent cats, not furriness. And in terms of that's the purpose that the mental state hung around for, or something like that. And that's the kind of idea that teleosemantics has, that they would put the purpose would be filled out by evolutionary considerations. And so I think that that's a promising start here to make our way into this. But one of the interesting consequences of these kinds of views is that it turns out that you probably don't know what you're thinking about most of the time. So to take one example, consider unicorns. You think you're thinking about a non-existent mythical creature, maybe something like a horse with a horn, or, although I have recently found out that there are some cultures who think they were proto-humans or something like that, so it's not clear whether they really are horses. That's a deep puzzle. The metaphysics of this stuff. Would there ever be anything which counted as a unicorn? So just as a digression here, suppose that you think that we're about to use gene splicing to create unicorns, having just watched a John Oliver show on this. And so they say, okay, we take some horse, we splice in some DNA from a horned animal, and then we get a horse with a horn. Voila. Is that a unicorn? Well, close enough, you might say, for government work, but it's not clear whether unicorns really were horses. So here's one theory about where the idea of unicorns came from. Maybe it was a deformed goat. So maybe back in the year 856 AD or something, there was a goat that was malformed, had one horn. Someone saw it off in the distance, and they said, there's a horse with a horn or a unicorn or something like that. And so it's quite possible that all of our thoughts about unicorns trace back to that goat. And that's what we're thinking about, even though we don't know it. So this is a kind of startling, surprising result, many people would say, that these kinds of theories have, indicating that our access to at least or the contents of our thoughts is not as on a firm footing as we might have thought that it was. And considerations like this may even apply to things like pains and itches and tickles and tastes of chocolate. So, these are deep puzzles, and my goal is not to answer them, but to bring them up and to have some discussions about them. So why don't you tell me what you think? Have you ever had a case where you thought you were in a particular mental state and found out you were wrong? For instance, I have thought that I had really bad allergies. The experience I had was seeming like suggesting allergies to me, and then I was having a cold. I've had cases where I thought I was tasting orange juice, but I really was drinking milk or something like that. And I was wrong about what experience I was having. I thought I was tasting disgusting orange juice as opposed to delicious milk. So I would say these are kinds of common sense examples, but what do you guys think? Do we have infallible access to our own mind? Are there third person methods which may yield better answers? What do you think the notion of mental content is? Is there a sense in which we think about things in the world? And if so, how does that work? So these are the questions that I would like to bring up this month, Consciousness Lies. So stay tuned.